All right. Well, I'm Dave Richard. I'm the creative director on Dead by Daylight.
So, David, you have your new chapter announced in partnership with Ringu, and I'm just curious, when you add a new killer and a survivor in a new chapter, how does that affect your entire ecosystem? Like in Dead by Daylight, I know you have the public test servers and you do rigorous Q&A testing, but kind of give us like a little elevator pitch about how that affects the environment and of Dead by Daylight.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is one of our core pillars that every time we release a new chapter, new content, we want to kind of shake what players are used to and add entirely new gameplay in. So of course, for this chapter, it's the same strategy. So of course, the whole ecosystem will be affected since everything can be mixed and match. All the perks, all the strategy you can use with those perks, and also how these abilities and way to play are going to become different against that new killer power. So obviously there's a lot of thought process going into making this new character fun. Obviously that's always like the primary concern that we have. So a fun experience as the character and against that character, but also a balanced experience that can also be taken into competitive play.
Now, as this is a Ringu, not the American adaptation that is the Ring, can you kind of go over like the differences? Because I'm sure they went over the subtle differences between the two different franchises for the viewers who are maybe unfamiliar with the Japanese franchise and just have seen the Ring.
Yeah, you're correct. So Ringu is from Japan. That's the original content, and it triggers something quite unique at the time in the horror world. It's quite different from what we're used to see. As it's not a slasher movie, it is using different triggers of fear, and so it hit the imagination of people in Japan and all over the world. So there's been all sort of different versions of the Ring made. So of course there's the American one that we're used to here, as the Korean version. There's of course it's based on a novel. There's the Japanese version. There's multiple different storyline and continuity into the Japanese version that they've done as well. So it's a pretty interesting universe. The American version and the Japanese version are still pretty close in themes. Like the character is pretty similar. The curse is similar as well. That's well explained. But for anyone that haven't seen the original version, I would recommend that they go watch this classic.
Now, how does this new killer and survivor, or just new chapter in general, affect the archives? Because that's a whole, that's got to be a whole other thing by itself, a monumental task of making it make sense and fitting in the challenges and the story and getting everything in Dead by Daylight straight so people know what's going on with the entity and the new killer and survivor. Talk a little bit about that.
We were smart enough at the time of creating this project to make it quite loose in terms of universe rules. Like we knew that down the line we would add new fantasies, new characters, and new licenses as part of this game as much as we could. And so we wanted to make sure that they would be able to fit into the universe seamlessly. It takes effort every time, but as seamlessly as possible. So designing the entity universe as being a metaverse, and that the entity has the power to take people from different timelines, different continuity. There's it's out of space-time rules, so that makes it easier obviously to mix and match all of these characters, and quite interesting. So going into the archive, now that we're explaining more in detail about the how the entity work and in the grand scheme of things, obviously all of these licenses needs to be incorporated into these rules, but I think they fit pretty well. We don't get the chance to explore these licenses into the archive as much as we like to. It happened. We just not just, but we announced recently that we were going to do a Saw archive collaboration, so that's pretty great. I wish that we can do more in the archive with that, to explore more in depth the stories of these licenses, but it's not going to happen every time.
It is really interesting how there is a story, and like despite what a casual player may think, there's a lot of story and lore and in the Dead by Daylight universe with the entity and with every new chapter and with the archives. And I just think it's so interesting. It's part of your game that I don't think a lot of players realize is there. And I know a lot of work goes into it as well.
Yes, absolutely. There's a great narrative team that are using their brain power to create all of these links between all of the different universe and make it something interesting and unique and keep the mystery there. You know, every time we answer a question, we add several more to make sure that what we love is to see the community getting this information and having theories and trying to decipher what it's all about. One thing that I like a lot about licensed content in the archive is that at some point the observer in the archive discovers that there is a link between artists of many worlds that get influenced by, you know, the cosmos and the entity and get like visions of other worlds, and that's what gives them in their imagination the power to create stories. And so like that, we can explain that characters like Freddy and Michael Myers, that for us are part of stories and movies, are indeed in another world quite real. And so the Dead by Daylight version of these characters are quite real.
I mean, you guys are constantly learning, like, all the time with like your past DLCs and new chapter releases, as well as like with your Frog Whispers. But what did you learn specifically about Portrait of Murder that you applied and improved upon in your next chapter for Ringu?
There's so much difference between creating a chapter based on a license and original content. Like, lessons learned that are not about processes or skill-based or tools about an original chapter are going to be better applied to other original chapter when we talk about, you know, themes, lore, what the players loved, because this is where we have control, where a license is already defined and we need to work with these constraints. That said, we do collect a lot of data, a lot of feedback on, you know, the power of our past chapters and the modification that we do over balance and fixes like that. And that can be applied, the theory of it can be applied to the gameplay of new power and perks that we're adding to the next chapter.
So aside from the killer, you also have a new survivor and like, what are some of the challenges when making a survivor? Because a survivor, unlike a killer, doesn't have like a unique power, right? Or unique chase music. You know what I mean? They're basically a new character model. So how do you express your creativity just in that model to make it stand out from other survivors that are currently in the roster?
Yeah, great question. So I'm gonna go generic at first for like original survivors and license alike, but then I want to go into the details of Yoichi because that's quite an interesting story. So for survivor, what is really important for us is that they represent part of our community. So when you said it, they're basically shells, right? They do have story and we can feel empathy towards them, but they're basically a vessel to put whatever power and perk you want to use with, you know, in terms of gameplay. But when you have a character that represents your origin or your personality, you know, a style that you love, that's what pleases us when the community can use this character like this. So creating different survivors, we want to make sure that we hit these different notes and personality for our community. Now, in terms of what they bring as a story and how they enrich a universe, that's also important. And for Yoichi, this is where the story gets quite interesting, because Yoichi is a kid in Ringu. So that's how we know him in both of the movies. He is a kid. He is affected by Sadako's power. He will lose his parents to Sadako, and he is actually the only survivor of the whole franchise. And for us, it was a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to take that character and continue his story in Dead by Daylight, something that, you know, the fans of Ringu were requesting or asking, what happened with Yoichi after the events of Ringu? And so we created an adult version, he's now mature, he's now an adult version of Yoichi, and we could expand on all of his story from the kid version of the movie up until now.
And this isn't more of a question, more of a compliment. Your game is is so inclusive and so diverse, and I really can't think of another game that has this amount of variety in it in terms of survivors and killers and representing certain people, ethnicities. You guys do such a great job with that. I have to commend you for it.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's definitely a goal. We want to make sure that we are inclusive and that people feel represented and and celebrate our differences.
And then, so I know like you can't talk the really specific nitty gritty details of this new chapter, but can you talk about if we're going to get a new map?
No map, but other surprises.
Now, what dictates for you guys when you decide to make a new map? Like when you're in your little huddle and you're in your board in your developer room, when you decide this is a good chance for a new map, or we're going to pass on a map this time, talk us through that creative process.
All right. Yes. Okay. So when we look into creating new maps, of course, maps are gigantic assets. They take a lot of energy and team bandwidth. And so we can only do so much in a year. So obviously there's a lot of thought process on when we should do it. Usually we want to make sure that we will create a new environment that have not been seen before in Dead by Daylight. So if a license, for example, or a new chapter would be too close to a team map that we already have, we would pass. We also want to make sure that in the gameplay, we can feature something that's going to be playable in our metrics. So, it makes sense and would be fun. So sometimes maps or environment from a license would be not adequate for proper gameplay, so we would need to pass. Also, sometimes there competition between our different chapter, and we have to select, even though everything works, we have to select just two. So we take what is most iconic for the fans, so that it's great addition to the game.
Now, can you talk us through the process about this? Is obviously a licensed chapter, but like, how do you work with the IP holders in this case? Can you give us some idea of like when you present the idea, or when you present like a rough idea of what the killer will look like, or how it moves, or the power, and how you go back and forth, and how you work with the original IP holder to make it so they're happy and it works in the game as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Working with Kadokawa has been a lot of fun. They, of course, like most licensors, they're really close to their universe. They love their character and their story, and they know a lot about their universe. So it was fun to get more information about what their universe is. So that helps us making the right choice and understanding their character rules correctly. So how the process works is that we usually start with a pitch. Creatively, we basically do a sell pitch towards them, saying this is why your universe and your character have a place in DBD, and why they should be represented, and how they should be represented in DBD, and why is this so cool. And then towards the whole process, the whole production, we go back and forth on validating that the assets, the story that we're creating, the sound and everything really is accurate on the universe they're building. So an example that's quite interesting with Sadako is that one of the rule of the character is that she does not touch others. That was a hard rule. So of course, Dead by Daylight, but any player that play DBD know that the killer needs to attack, pick up, put on hook, and a lot of action that have to directly interact with the survivor. And so we had to find clever ways to represent that in game and follow the rule of no touching with Sadako.
Very interesting. How cryptic. It's for those of you watching, like Dave can't talk about everything. They got to save some stuff for later, so he's not going to talk about specifics. But that's really interesting. I mean, what an interesting challenge for you and your team. Because I know Hellraiser proved a challenge too, because he's very stoic. He's not going to bend down. And that was a really creative way you guys figured out how he picked up survivors. So I can't wait to see what you do with Ringu. That sounds really interesting.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can't wait to show that off to you as well. It's quite interesting.
Now, can you talk about, can you give us an idea of how she moves? I mean, because obviously in the American version, which is what I'm familiar with, she crawls on all fours. Is that something you can talk about, like the movement of the killer in this new chapter?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can talk about it. So, of course, in the Japanese version, there's also some very iconic moment that struck our imagination. There's crawling out of the TV. There's the well. There's like that weird VHS backward movement. And so obviously these are all elements that we wanted to make sure that we represent in the game as well. So the art, animation, VFX, audio team has done an amazing job again to get this character likeness in DBD well made. This is all I can say.
It's really interesting. Like, in your personal opinion, is it easier or harder to work with licensed IP when adding a new chapter to your game, or working with an original license that you guys are creating, or do they both have their own unique challenges and difficulties?
Yeah, definitely. They are both challenging in different ways. It's for a license, there's already a base that's there, a sandbox in which we can play. There's already some rules. And so these limitations are, of course, can cause challenges, but they are also helping because we know what the boundaries are. When we're creating an original chapter, we don't have any boundaries. So creating these boundaries inside of which to be creative is the challenge, because without boundaries, it's not going to be as interesting. It's just going to make something that's anything or everything. So creating these boundaries and then working inside them are the actual challenge.
And again, I think this is more of a compliment than a question, but I really appreciate how you guys, because you have some players who are brand new to the game, some players who play casually, and some players who have thousands of hours in the game. And when you're designing a new chapter or a new killer or new perks, I can see that this is for the people who really want to challenge themselves. This killer is really hard to use for that audience. I just really can appreciate that you try to have this wide variety of killers for people who want to play an easy killer, or people who want to play a really challenging killer. And I can just really appreciate from a game design point, that's really cool that you guys do that. Not a lot of games do that, cater to such a wide range of player base.
Well, that's great. Thank you. That you realize this is awesome too. It's just like the maps or the different character or the fact that we have licensed original. It's something that we balance towards the year. Absolutely. Like, this one is more accessible, this one is more challenging, this one, and we want to make sure that we have a lot of variety for the fan base.
I feel like behavior is always juggling like 10 different balls, because I mean from the outside looking in, people see a release date of a chapter and I think a lot of people assume that, oh, that's the one they're working on now, but you're constantly juggling several chapters. I mean, you have a year, you have put 4 chapters out a year, or 4 chapters out a year, correct?
Yes.
Right. So you're talking about this one now. This is the latest one, but you're already working on probably the next 3 chapters and varying levels of design and mechanics.
Yes, correct.
Is that difficult for you and your team that juggle so many balls?
Yeah. We call it plate spinning. We just want to make sure that all these plates stay up. Absolutely. Of course, it's challenging. It's a lot of fun too. There's it's not slowing down, so it's thrilling. We always something to think about. And of course, there's the 4 chapter, there's the archive tomes, there's all the different life balance, new mechanics, quality of life, community interaction, the marketing, all of these things that cater to different type of people, and all of them are important. So of course it's a challenge, but it's what is keeping us alive and well.
What are you most excited about for players to experience when they can finally get their hands on this new Ringu chapter?
Right. So I love this chapter because it will bring a special new type of feeling to the game. Just like the movie has a different vibe, doom and gloom, has a different vibe than a slasher movie. Playing as this killer and against this killer will have a different vibe in Dead by Daylight. Without going into details, there are some sort of 2 ways to approach this killer or to face this killer, and it really represents that feeling of what's in the movie of getting that phone call that tells you have 7 days to live, that doom that's always with you. So that's what I think is going to be a great experience for the players, and I can't wait to see what they are doing with that.
And when can people experience the Ringu chapter on console and PC?
PTB on February 15th, and then the content is going to be available for everybody on March 8th.
That's great, David. And then, because I have you for 2 more minutes, I have like just a fun question, just a little fun question. Yeah. Me and my friend always debate about keyboard versus controller, because obviously keyboard, people call keyboard the superior interface. When you were designing the game or working with any killer, any survivor, just the game mechanics in general, do you have controller in mind? Are you starting on keyboard and then adapt it to controller? Like talk about, can you talk about that process?
Oh yeah, I have a controller with me at all times, and of course my keyboard and mouse. We do play both. Since the very early days of DBD, actually, when we started, we were 2 main designers on the title, and I was playing mouse and keyboard, he was playing controller only. And so the game from ground up was always designed for both in mind. And we're trying our best to keep the quality equal and keep it balanced and usable for both. Our amazing QA team is always also testing both controls.